Wonderful. All right, so thank you for joining us today. My name is Nam-hee Lee. I teach modern Korean history and also direct the Center for Korean Studies at UCLA. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, and as many of you know only too well, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the war has overdetermined the trajectory of the Korean Peninsula in general and the U.S.-South Korea relations in particular. The Center for Korean Studies, with the co-sponsorship of the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Los Angeles, organized a series of talks inviting a group of distinguished scholars whose scholarship has engaged with some of the fundamental issues related to the process and formation of the Cold War on the peninsula, the ways in which the war has affected the lives of the people in both Koreas and beyond, as well as the various dimensions of the South Korea and the U.S. relations. Today's presentation is the first of a two-part webinar series that we planned for this fall. I'd like to thank, before we begin, Consul Dong-Wan Yu, who's been coordinating this series with me. And before I introduce today's speaker, Professor Catherine Moon, I would like to turn over to Consul General Kyung-jae Park, who would like to say a few words of welcome. I just found out that actually Consul General Park arrived in LA just in August. Welcome, Consul General Park, and please start.
Thank you, Professor Lee. My name is Kyung-jae Park, and I am a new Consul General of Korea in LA. I arrived here last May, so it's been 5 months now. I would like to make just short remarks to congratulate this webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series entitled Perspective on South Korea, United States Relations since Korean War, co-hosted by the Center for Korean Studies at UCLA and the Consulate General in Los Angeles. On behalf of the Korean Consulate General in LA, I would like to thank everyone who has made today's event possible. My special thanks go to Professor Nam-hee Lee and Professor Heonik Kwon for their precious time and hard work. I also extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Catherine Moon for sharing her insight and expertise. The main focus of this webinar series is the Korean War and the South Korea's relations with the United States. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of Korean War. The South Korea-US alliance that began as promised in the midst of a devastating war has lasted and grown into a strong partnership over the 7 decades. This alliance has gone beyond the boundaries of the Korean Peninsula and has now developed into a powerful partnership striving for world peace. I believe that this webinar will give great opportunity to deepening our understanding of the historical context and important contemporary issues related to Korean Peninsula and the ROK-US alliance. Once again, thank you so much for participating in and attending today's event, and I hope that you all will be staying safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Before I introduce our speaker today, I am told that I need to make a few announcements. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on our center's website. And after speaker's presentation, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. All you have to do is make sure to post your questions on the Q&A box that's at the very end of the slide or the screen. And I believe that we will not be able to see you if you raise your hand. It's a webinar and not a Zoom session, so please make sure to post your question. And those of you who may be new to the center's event, just very briefly, the Center for Korean Studies promotes Korean studies at UCLA and engages not only the UCLA community, but also the general public with various issues related to Korea and beyond by organizing lecture series, symposia, film screening, and cultural events. So please visit our website to learn more about our programs and events. Now, I'm very much honored and excited to have Professor Catherine Moon as our first speaker of the series. Professor Moon is Professor of Asian Studies and Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College. She was the inaugural holder of the Korea Studies Chair at the Brookings Institution from 2014 to 2016. She's also member of the National Committee on North Korea Advisory Committee and an affiliated faculty at the Korea Institute, Harvard University. She's the author of Sex Among Allies, Military Prostitution in U.S.-Korea Relations, that came out in 1997, and Protesting America, Democracy and the U.S.-Korea Alliance, that was published in 2013. I just wanted to say briefly again, the first book, Sex Among Allies, remains one of the most important English language books on the topic of the South Korea-U.S. relations. Her book has been widely read and cited by scholars and students working across a wide range of disciplines, history, sociology, political science, gender studies, to name a few. And it continues to serve as a staple on syllabi across these disciplines. Actually, my graduate seminar is reading this book again tomorrow. Actually, we're discussing it tomorrow. Professor Moon's presentation today is on a new research that she's currently undertaking and is entitled After the War, Land and Property Claims in Unification. Thank you for agreeing to speak for us today. And Professor Moon, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Hee. I'm really glad to join people here. I really wish I could reach out and say hello in person, but we'll do the best we can with the video and audio setup. As Nam-hee mentioned, this is a new area of study for me, and I'm finding it quite challenging, really intellectually intriguing, and frankly quite daunting. And realizing that the issue of land, what to do with land in North Korea, that will most likely invite numerous claims and also create some confusion and potential social conflict in a scenario of reconciliation and unification. What to do about land is truly a daunting question. And I think it is not possible to answer the numerous questions that come with this issue by one person. It really needs a huge team of experts in varied fields. So my talk today is less about telling you what I know, but raising questions and inviting people to try to like this research and to try to engage the kinds of questions I will be posing, because they're really important for the future of the Korean Peninsula, for the people on the peninsula and their livelihood, their welfare, their social stability, as well as, of course, economic reconstruction and prosperity for Koreans on the peninsula in a unification and post-unification situation. And of course, all that translates into stability potentially for the region and hopefully not instability and further conflict. So I address the issue of property claims in a scenario of peaceful reunification, planned unification. And of course, I'm assuming here that it would be led by the South Korean political economic system as a model. I don't think the South Koreans and many of the neighbors around the peninsula would be willing or happy to unify under a socialist system. So I'll just put it out there and to remind us that my talk is based on this kind of an assumption. But what's important is not absorption, but careful negotiation, first within South Korean society, with North Korea as a government and the people, and then of course in the region, with partners in the region. So numerous conflicting property claims, I believe, inevitably will arise in any unification process because of historical factors, mainly the division of the peninsula, the expropriation of private property and its redistribution through land reform by North Korean communists in the 1940s and 50s, and of course the Korean War, which created chaos and tremendous internal displacement of people who abandoned their properties and had to take off in order to save their lives, most of whom probably did not travel with proper land documentation. And that is, of course, going to be a big issue. So legal and administrative mechanisms for addressing and resolving grievances and claims around land and other property must rank high on the list of any serious plans for inter-Korean reconciliation, peace, and unification. Providing personal security to people is, of course, a practical and moral task for those who manage the process of reconciliation and unification. It's also a prerequisite for economic development and social stability. Without the codification, the implementation, and the enforcement of laws and procedures for adjudicating property claims, the following cannot take place on solid ground, both literally and figuratively. Investment in infrastructure such as roads, and the building of residential structures, schools, hospitals, factories, office buildings, just to name some. I have, over the last few years, researched on and off this issue, and I have found it to be alarmingly understudied by scholars and possibly too shallowly studied by policy types. And what I have found is that there is no real literature, so to speak, but there is discourse. And the discourse mostly stems from South Korean society, which is natural, from ROK government agencies, South Korean lawyers, legal organizations, blogs, and other forms of communication channels, as well as the media touching upon this issue once in a while. And when I survey some of this material, I find that there is a two-way, what shall we call it? A two-way, a dualistic or a double-edged tendency. One is what I call economistic, and I'll explain that in a minute. And the other is an over-reliance on the case of German unification. So my talk today asks people to think about non-economic or non-economistic approaches to this issue of land rights, adjudication, and settlement issues, and also to consider other case studies, not just the German case, that might be able to offer us really valuable lessons and provide some deeper thinking that's really necessary. By economistic, I'm referring to this emphasis that I read in some of the literature, or rather the discourse, the tendency to focus on the high costs of unification and the desire to focus on three prongs: speed, fairness, and efficient control. These are not my concepts. These are concepts that Koreans and one or two US-based scholars have used to describe a desired path toward privatization. And their model, or their emphasis on speed, fairness, and efficient management or efficient control, come from international economists' prescriptions for privatization in the post-Soviet bloc early in the 1990s. And I think it's really important to question whether that model, whether the lessons learned from privatization and the emphasis on privatization in the prescribed ways that international economists had emphasized, whether these are really the right choices for the Koreans to pursue when the issue of unification needs to be seriously planned. And by critiquing the economistic model, I want to highlight other approaches, namely a transitional justice or restorative justice approach. There is a huge literature on this topic that spans a wide part of the globe, making sense of post-conflict situations around the world where the inquiry is based on this notion of transitional justice that emphasizes the experiences that people had in conflict zones during times of conflict, whether it was domestic conflict or international conflict. Transitional justice helps bridge the past and future. The concept involves both official and unofficial measures to recognize past wrongs that were perpetrated on victims. It also involves reconciliation and the healing of communities, and it involves the legitimation and societal, what we might call buy-in, of new institutions and norms for political, economic, social life post-conflict. I think the Korean Peninsula will become a really rich case of transitional justice, because unification cannot soundly be based or soundly take place without human to human, people to people healing, people to people reconciliation, which involves the recognition of past wrongs and efforts to redress those wrongs. Land that had been illegally, forcibly expropriated by governments, in this case, the DPRK regime, is of course a violation of a human right, a violation of many, many domestic and international laws. And in many societies that have experienced this kind of expropriation, and sometimes with violence, the issue of land restitution or compensation becomes primary in a context of reconciliation and reconstruction. And I think the Koreas will not be an exception. There is another critique I might offer of the trend so far in the discourse that I have found on land rights, property adjudication, and a potential unification situation. And that critique is this, that there is a lack of transparency and democratic deliberation regarding this issue. So very few people are thinking about it and talking about it and writing about it. And those who have the clearest idea of what might happen are in a small group of elites, primarily in the ROK government. And then there are some legal scholars, economists who are raising these questions. But as far as the policy ideas go, that are fielded by government or quasi-governmental agencies, one needs to press them in the future to be more transparent so that South Korean people who are living in a democracy can know what kinds of ideas are floating around. What people might be deliberating now, way before unification, of course, becomes precedence in many people's minds. That's the material, that's the foundation that people will build on when they have to face real life unification challenges. So having a deliberative, participatory reality, a discussion in the nation as well as across nations actually would yield better assessments and potentially better options, and of course, potential legitimacy when the decisions are made. With reference to the specifics of potential policy, the most specific policy discussions emanate from the Korea National Asset Management Corporation, or KAMCO. I'll offer you a slide in a minute. And that is a quasi-governmental arm of the South Korean government that deals with a variety of asset management issues. I offer the slide here. I'm going to share the screen. Sorry, I'm trying to share the screen. Okay. Can everyone see that, I hope? So this is a brief excerpt from the website of KAMCO. It's in English and in Korean, and I offer the English version. I'll give you a minute to read it over. And the only public document that's come out of KAMCO regarding the issue of North Korean land issues or land rights was back in September 2013, a report based on a 2012 workshop it was a private workshop of mostly governmental officials in South Korea who met to discuss possible issues that may come up. There was a forum in 2019 that addressed proposals and policy ideas regarding the North Korean land issue, but my research assistant was not able to locate it, and it may not have been published or shared with the public as of yet. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. So transparency and deliberation will be very important. Hold on 1 minute. I have to get back into my notes here. Okay, sorry about that. The other point I would like to make is to expand a bit on what I consider to be an over-reliance on the German experience based on the literature or discourse that I have become familiar with. And specifically, the South Korean government officials, scholars, seem to have decided already that symbolic compensation will be the way to go in dealing with land adjudication rather than land restitution to claimants of that land, people who had had land expropriated from them. So symbolic compensation, compensation or restitution, these are the two approaches that are widely available for governments that try to deal with land adjudication issues in post-conflict situations. And numerous countries have dealt with these issues, of course, in the former Soviet bloc, as well as South Africa, that dealt with land adjudication issues and redistribution, land claims in the post-apartheid period, starting from the mid-1990s onward. Cyprus, the Mediterranean island that's been divided into North and South, also has been negotiating various aspects of their division and potential reconciliation. And of course, land has been a primary sticking point in those discussions. So there are many models out there, or many cases out there, cases of countries that have adopted compensation, cases of countries that have adopted restitution. And I think it's important not to just settle on the German case and forgo these other potential lessons. The reason why the South Koreans have already decided on a compensation structure or compensation system rather than restitution is simply because people studied the German unification case and decided that it was a nightmare. Dealing with land issues was a nightmare in Germany. Germany opted for land restitution, to actually restore the land, the plots of land that had been taken away by the East German communist authorities, rather than to opt for compensation. Germany dealt with around 2 million claims, separate cases, involving, as one scholar estimated, possibly 5 million people in East Germany. And this created such a problem, and social instability as well as economic instability. And eventually Germany had to decide to switch to a compensation system and just completely give up the restitution effort because of the complexities and because it was so expensive. And by compensation, we're not talking real value for the land at current prices, of course. It's a nominal value that would be placed on the land that is recognized. So the German case was so difficult, and in the German case, land issues even led to the assassination of the government official who was in charge of managing land assets management. This gentleman was assassinated in 1991. He was one of the very familiar faces of reunification policy in Germany, and his assassination allegedly was undertaken by an ultra-left faction in Germany, the Red Army faction, opposing privatization and market economy, etc. So no one wants to have that kind of a situation occur on the Korean Peninsula. So it's understandable that the terrible lessons the Germans experienced become so important for Koreans to heed. Nevertheless, modeling reunification and land policies on one country's experience, I think, makes no sense. And I would ask people to consider that there are numerous examples of land restitution and compensation that stem from the post-Soviet states. Hungary had a relatively, I would say, model version of land rights based on compensation with some minimal restitution. Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, they all had different systems worth investigating, in addition to the German case. Cyprus, the Mediterranean island, as well as post-apartheid South Africa, also presents some interesting lessons that Koreans might benefit from. Just to give you an example, in contrast to the German case, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Bulgaria all opted for the restitution of land rather than compensation to former owners of agricultural lands for varying reasons, based on different criteria, which were based on different degrees of expropriation and levels of collectivization. So Poland, for example, did not opt for compensation, did not opt for restitution at all, because collectivization of land had not prevailed in Poland. This is something I had not known. I thought the Soviet Soviet-era states had pretty much more or less similar types of development in this category. but not so. And in Poland, 75% of farmland had remained in family farms during the communist era. So land restitution didn't really make sense for the Poles. I also think that the issue of timing is important. So in Eastern and Central Europe, one of the big issues debated regarding land restitution or compensation had to do with land taken over by the communist regimes versus land that had been expropriated by the Soviets. That is, in the case of Germany, when East Germany had been a Soviet, been under Soviet occupation, does that make the unified German government responsible for the actions of the Soviet authorities from 1945 to 1949? The German government, the unified government, decided no and excluded that period of 1945 to 49 from any possibility of restitution, or rather compensation, or restitution then compensation. This created quite a bit of discontent among some former landowners, and the German government was taken to court many, many times over this issue of the time period. What time periods would be included, excluded? This is another issue that many of these Eastern and Central European countries dealt with that might be worth looking into for the Korean case. There are other issues related to the management of land claims in a unification situation. In addition to whether to take the compensation route or the restitution route, there are also many ways to configure a compensation system. It's very, very complicated. And so numerous models, numerous case studies need to be examined to come up with the best practice applicable for the Korean Peninsula. Also, eligibility requirements. Who is eligible to claim land for restitution or compensation? The deadline for claims applications, when should it be set up? Will it be too short a time span for people to get their paperwork together? How long will it take to adjudicate each land claim? All these things are very, very important and complicated. And again, the Eastern Central European cases, not just Germany, have much to teach us. There are other issues such as centralized versus decentralized administrative bodies that would manage land claims. The issue of whether a land claims court would be fully independent or not. In the case of South Africa, the Land Claims Court, that's what it's called, to deal with land claims in the post-apartheid era, was deemed one of the model institutions of transition because it was independent, authoritative, and considered not corrupt, at least in the initial stages of the post-apartheid regime. And the other considerations, of course, social welfare considerations for North Koreans. You can't just evict people off of the property they're living on or working on. So how to manage the land needs of everyday North Koreans, how to deal with Pyongyang or Wonsan or Siniju or some of these areas that have very highly developed real estate markets and that seem to demonstrate some type of a private property, quasi-private property regime. What do we do about these special cities where real estate has become so valuable as well as very coveted so that people will not be giving up land and buildings very easily? And then the last 2 points, issues of cultural sensitivities around land and property. This may sound a little strange, but when I was researching this, I found the issue of ancestral and burial grounds, sanso in Korean, to be something worth thinking about. that we need to think about land in the varied ways people live on land, use land, and the meaning of land in families and in communities. For many Koreans, including North Koreans, and I've done lots of interviews with North Korean diaspora members in recent years on a different book project, and I have found it startling how much they still abide by Confucian ancestral rites and Tisa, etc. So issues of ancestral lands. This is something I put aside as a question mark because I have not really developed it, but it's something that intrigues me. And then the last consideration when we're thinking about land and what we can learn from other country cases is, again, the transitional justice considerations. How did other countries that dealt with similar dilemmas address the need for healing and for cooperation and for mutual understanding and reconciliation of peoples, and not only aim for efficiency and speed and rationalization of managing land assets. Now I just want to spend the remainder of the time addressing the complexity of the Korean land issues that I foresee. I'll focus mostly on the issue of eligibility. Who will be eligible to claim return of land or symbolic compensation? Who will be eligible for legal claim to the current land they are living on or working on? And here I'm talking about North Koreans, of course, not just who had been dispossessed of land and fled to the south, which is primarily what South Korea's discourse is about. So I'm going to go through a list of individuals. I'm not even thinking about organizations or communal property such as religious groups, churches, Buddhist monasteries, etc., that may seek to reclaim land. This has happened in Eastern and Central Europe. And of course, the Jewish diaspora in Eastern Central Europe has been very, very active in dealing with both individually dispossessed claims as well as communally dispossessed claims. But here, I'm just going to go through some eligibility issues that might come up for primarily individuals. Who is eligible to claim land in a unification setting? North Korean citizens, of course, in the North. And what about the North Korean diaspora who seek to return to the North? What about North Korean citizens with claims to land in South Korea? This last question intrigues me because no one seems to be raising it as a possibility. And yet there is one legal case in recent years that seems to be a precedent that people might rely on for current North Korean residents having the right to some to land in South Korea in some instances. Another group, non-DPRK residents as of the official date, non-DPRK citizens who reside in the DPRK as of the official date of future unification. I raise this because I learned that Hungary limited compensation claims to, of course, Hungarian citizens who either at the time of expropriation were citizens or they were citizens when they were suffering the damage. Also, individuals who had sustained damage in conjunction with the deprivation of Hungarian citizenship. And the Hungarian government made it possible for non-Hungarian citizens who were permanent residents of Hungary on December 31st, 1990, when Hungary became a republic. The government allowed non-Hungarian citizens who were permanent residents of Hungary on December 31st, 1990, to claim land. And then, of course, descendants or surviving spouses would be eligible if the actual previous owner were deceased. I raise this because North Korea, as much as the regime likes to boast of its mono tradition or mono heritage of Tanil Minjok, of one Korean lineage, one Korean bloodline, the reality is, as in South Korea increasingly, there are people of mixed nationalities and ethnicities living in North Korea, primarily from China, some from Japan, some who came, most of them who came many, many decades ago and were able to blend in to North Korean society. I have no idea how North Korea views these people legally, what their citizenship status, permanent residency status is. But I think for those of us who ask these kinds of questions, we need to be as inclusive as possible so that whatever minority groups or individuals exist in North Korea, that they also not be dispossessed of land. And then, of course, the big batch of claimants will probably stem from the Republic of Korea, South Korean citizens with claims to land in the North. These are people who fled the North during the Korean War or prior to that time, many of whom do not possess proper documentation, and they will be seeking to have land compensated or restituted, whatever the policy choice will be. And then I ask, what about ROK citizens who are permanent residents outside Korea, permanent residents of other countries? Would they be eligible or not? Or what about South Korean citizens who are deceased, but whose heirs reside outside Korea or are citizens of other countries? Would they be eligible as the offspring of individuals whose land had been illegally taken? What about a North Korean who gets formal asylum status in, let's say, England and becomes a UK citizen? I ask this question based on many interviews I've had with North Koreans living in London. England happens to be one of the hotspots of the North Korean diaspora outside of South Korea. And so what if a North Korean with UK citizenship out of necessity wants to seek land that he or she was dispossessed of or had believes that they had claim to in a context of unification? And then the next category of people or entities that might be eligible or not are foreigners, basically, those who either, quote, purchased or received legal rights of land use in North Korea, primarily for businesses and real estate speculation. We know that North Korea, the regime, has been trying to sell land in real estate in downtown Sinuiju to Chinese developers or other businesses. And of course, we know about the Najin Sanbong and the Hwanggumpyeong Island areas where land has been made available to foreign investors, primarily Chinese. And let me show you a slide here. Hold on a minute, please. I'm going to share screen. I cut and paste from documents that detail the DPRK's law on Nasan and the special economic zones. This is a 1993 law that came into existence, and the law guarantees the legal recognition of investors to use the property and for the state not to nationalize it. I'll give you a few seconds to read it. I'll stop share screen. So in this kind of a case involving foreigners, what should rights to land be, both in terms of, if not actually claiming ownership of land, which is highly unlikely, the buildings, the infrastructure that had been placed by the investors. What's the compensation scheme on that? So contractual obligations that the unified government would have to take on is basically what I'm getting at. Besides eligibility, there are other considerations that would create huge headaches in dealing with land issues in a unification context. They include the compensation structure, how much, and in what form, a compensation note, vouchers, bonds. Will resale be permitted or not? Hungary, for example, capped its compensation for land per plot the cap was at about 21,000 US dollars at the time. And there was a sliding scale depending on the value of the land, the size of the land per claim. I don't know how the government came up with that figure, but these are, again, worth investigating. And then other complexities due to what I would call the very active civil society in South Korea, and what I would venture to guess will be an active civil society in North Korea eventually, because of the South Korean model. That in the Eastern and Central European situation, when it came to land claims and property adjudication, it wasn't just individuals, but also civic organizations and international networks that came into play. The power and the recognized legitimacy of some of these organizations became quite impressive as pressure points to modify existing laws about land claims and adjudication, and to press for changes. And the organization that did the most, I think, and still is very active in dealing with former Jewish properties, is the World Jewish Restitution Organization. Its reach is quite impressive. The depth of research, investigation, as well as perseverance in trying to reclaim or get compensation for different Jews around the world whose land had been taken illegally, either by the Nazis, by the Soviets, or the communist regimes. This is a fact that is quite abiding, and they're still at work, as I mentioned. So if we were to see organizations or activist groups that advocate for North Korean land rights, for South Koreans' land rights, for South Korean diaspora's land rights, I mean, you can just imagine the kinds of political pressures that could multiply in a democratic society. And then finally, South Korea itself and its legal world itself today provide us with some interesting things to think about as to the really complex situation regarding potential land issues in a unification setting. So even without reconciliation or unification, South and North Koreans have been testing the ROK legal system in order to claim family property and inheritance on behalf of relatives living in the DPRK, currently living in the DPRK. In May of 2012, the ROK National Assembly actually passed a law recognizing this need and trend, passed a law to codify and rationalize the legal standards and procedures for North Koreans seeking to reclaim their personal identity as a ROK citizen. I'll explain that in Q&A if anybody's interested. And more to the point, to enable current North Korean citizens to be able to claim property and inheritance rights through the South Korean legal system. There are several lawsuits that have been placed, some which have been concluded, wherein the court judged in favor of recognizing inheritance or property rights of North Koreans currently living in the DPRK. And when assets were deemed to belong to the current residents of North Korea, these assets were to be held in trust until unification. So the South Korean legal system is already recognizing North Koreans' rights to property writ large, even before unification, to be made real upon unification. And one question that of course stems from this information is, how will these lawsuits serve as precedents for future lawsuits in a reunification, in a time of reunification? And how will they color the way that the South Korean public and potentially North Koreans view their own claims, and whether or not they will abide by what the government elites will determine. And then I'll end here with another complication, which may or may not become a real issue, but just to highlight the zaniness, the craziness of people when it comes to their desire to benefit from land. There is an unofficial market in South Korea for trading land documents that were owned by former North Korean residents who had brought these documents with them to the South during the Korean War. So many people who had come to the South apparently sold their documents for money out of need. And these documents have been floating around in the South for decades and decades, and they continue to be exchanged somewhat as a stock. So the value of this so-called land document or stock is determined by inter-Korean relations. When inter-Korean relations get warmer, the value of this stock rises. And of course, when inter-Korean relations do not fare well, then the value of this stock or the land documents declines. Ultimately, the owners of these land documents expect to receive compensation from the government. Now, I doubt that these land documents might be able to be eligible for such compensation, especially if they're not held by the original landowner. On the other hand, and I'll put a ... since so much of what I am discussing today is hopefully educated speculation, but at any rate, I wanted to point out the difficulties and the headaches that will for certain come due to land conflict issues. And on a practical note, I would plead for those who get involved in the management of unification to start really thinking, deliberating on these issues before unification discussions, meaning official negotiations, rather than during, because we have a plethora of documentation from other countries and societies that we can learn from. And because this issue is so thorny and can lead to such instability, resentment, social resentment, and difficulty in getting both South and North Koreans to accept the new institutions and arrangements of unification, if they feel so unsatisfied about the way that land issues are being adjudicated. So I'll end there. And my apologies for any missteps due to technology or the fact that I'm not able to look at any of you when I'm talking. And it's very, very awkward talking to just a camera and a screen. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take Q&A and have a discussion.
All right, that was just so very wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Moon. You gave us so much to think about, and there are so many issues that I would be interested in discussing further. But for now, let me pose just one question, and I'm hoping that that would also give the audience some time to pose their questions in the Q&A box. We understand fully how complex and complicated this issue of the property in the event of unification. And I appreciate your effort to deal with this very important, but again, very difficult issue, and your effort to broaden the conceptual, theoretical, historical framework in which we think about these issues. I just wanted to briefly mention to those of you who may not necessarily be familiar with sort of a trajectory of how this particular issue came about, not that I know anything about it, but just in the broader context of how the discourse of what we need to do, how we need to prepare, how South Korean society and Korean people need to prepare for the event of unification. I believe that was actually starting from the early 1990s, especially with the 1991 agreement that Roh-tae-woo signed with North Korea, the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. You begin to see, again, plethora of books, both academic and from civil society. And obviously, you also have many of the scholars and civil society engaged in this discussion. But this notion of legal framework within which we think about property and how to deal with this sort of possible claims that surely would arise in the event of unification. I think I sort of see that happening starting around 2005 or so. And as you mentioned, I think it is absolutely very limited as far, I mean, again, I don't really know a whole lot about, but from little of what I've looked at, given, again, the complex issue that is involved. So, again, I appreciate your effort very much. Now, but as a historian, there's just one issue that I like to sort of interject, and I don't know whether it's going to be helpful, but just thinking about what land reform meant in the historical context of 1945, because you do mention, and again and again, we can very easily imagine how this issue of restitution or compensation would arise. So again, as a way to prepare ourselves and perhaps as a sort of extend the argument of what you rightly discussed as a transitional justice, in the sense that we, as those of us who live in the present moment, have a certain sense of depth that we owe historical depth, right? And so that historical depth also might be, again, related to what actually happened, the social, political, and economic context of the post-1945, during which the land reform took place. So it's a well-known fact that when Korea was liberated from Japan, that more than 70% of the population were poor tenants. Very few people, even tenants, owned their land. And to have a land reform was on just about everybody's platform, whether you're nationalist or socialist. And in the sense, it was actually the demand of the time.
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to sort of get at is, given that historical context, how would we, again, when we discuss this issue, evaluate the land reform? I mean, we obviously think that the South Korean land reform was justified, given the demands of the time. In some ways, land reform was one of the top on the list of many thousand inchoate dreams of the Koreans at the time. And so, again, I don't think you need to respond to this particular question, but just wanted to sort of think about this issue of possible compensation or restitution with the issue of what we may call historical justification of land reform that took place both in South and North Korea.
I think you raise a very important point, and this is why, I don't know if I made this clear enough. We need historians.
Mm-hmm.
Historians are absolutely essential to helping shape future discourse about this issue, because exactly for the reasons you're talking about and more. And as far as land reform in the North goes, I think the key issue will be expropriation and lack of compensation at that time, and possible violence that had accompanied expropriation. And so even if on a popular level, land reform was well supported in both the South and North, the process by which land reform occurred could, I would assume, will become an issue. That if individuals can document forcible expropriation, of course, most of it was forcible, physically or otherwise violent expropriation, then I think people will come up with legal challenges, etc. Also, the second point here is that even though we as academics can appreciate the need for land reform, and that South Korea's economic development and path toward democratization and democracy could not have occurred without land reform, frankly. Mm-hmm. So we can look at all of the very necessary aspects of, not only positive, but necessary aspects of land reform in a capitalist South. But land in of itself, especially in South Korea, is such a politicized and political entity. Mm-hmm. As we know, the land speculation is, in a crazed state most of the time, historically, in South Korea. And so I think that kind of I don't want to call it a culture, but that kind of a popular trend to put so much financial and emotional and status and other stock in land, I think it's going to have an impact on the way that people revisit history or relearn history. So even if we make a case that there was a need, and so returning land to various individual owners may not be the best way to go, I think that would have a lot of resistance, because land is so scarce, for one thing, on the peninsula, arable good land, and then also because it is just so so valuable. I don't know how else to put it in South Koreans' lives in particular. So I foresee people coming from all over to poke at this pot of land compensation or possibly hypothetically restitution, and to sort of throw history aside.
Yes. Thank you so much. So I guess we already have actually quite a number of questions. So why don't I just go through them And I'm just going to briefly read them. The first question is a clarifying question by Bridget Martin. Why would DPRK state expropriations and collectivization be considered? I'm sorry, DPRK state expropriations and collectivization be considered illegal?
Well, that's a good question. I guess the simple answer is, if we look at especially Eastern and Central Europe, to me, that's where the answer lies. All these societies had different degrees and structures of collectivization, and also different types of expropriation. Because these regimes were not democratically elected on a real level. I mean, they call themselves the Democratic Republic of, but people did not have a choice, a political choice and voice in collectivizing land, in giving up their land. In some of these Eastern Central European countries, the government the communist regimes could have claimed that they had not formally expropriated, but rather received the gifts as, rather had received the lands as gifts on a voluntary basis from individuals who had owned them. But, that's pretty bogus reasoning. People were pressured, etc. So the fact that people did not get to choose to give up their land, they did not choose to collectivize, and it was done to them, I think that will be the basis, and especially if one is to reunify under a capitalist system, private property, past and future, become so much more salient than we might be thinking about at this point.
All right, great, thank you. There's another question by the same person, Bridget Martin. I am also wondering how Dr. Moon sees this set of issues as relating to vast damages and land and property requisitions that occurred during the Korean War. What would be the responsibilities of DPRK, ROK, US, and UN? Do you see this set of issues also coming up in a reunification discussion?
Did you say her name was Bridget?
Yes, Bridget Martin.
Okay, Bridget, these are really, really big questions. And yes, the one that Namhee just read, that's a huge question. I can't answer what the prescriptive course should be, but I would say that any land issues that get opened up through unification will exacerbate conflicts, contentions over land dealing with foreign entities. The area of research and policy that I know best addresses the US military bases in South Korea. Mm-hmm. And over the recent decades, there has been a lot of South Korean activism that is tied in with a transnational network of activists that protest, or that protest against, or that demand restitution, really, from the US military regarding environmental damage. Oil seepage in soil, for example, in downtown Seoul around the Yongsan base. These issues have been and still are live in South Korean society and in other countries that have been hosting US military bases. So whether it's the Korean War or whether it's the current use of South Korean soil, I think all land issues will become exacerbated, more contentious once this bag of worms get opened up regarding the North's lands. So I would say these are all up for grabs, both as research and as policy consideration, and of course, potential lawsuits.
From James Hilmer, a PhD student in history, apologies for a long question. Your talk raised many interesting points. As a historian, I'm interested in the role of history in these reconciliation processes. To what extent do you think we can consider reconciliation outside of solely economic terms? You mentioned the need to think outside these limited terms, but I wonder about a reverse process of rendering cultural and historical context into present-day political and economic stakes. The interpersonal conflicts and massacres of the post-liberation and Korean War period have had such a significant intergenerational impact on families' livelihoods. To what extent do other forms of historical violence and lived experience of the war factor into property claims? Would historical injustice, say by a notoriously heinous landlord, disqualify their offspring from reclaiming lands? Sorry for many questions.
Are you done? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I don't have an answer to that. That's you know, it's a huge question. As far as the specific aspect, whether a landlord that had been notoriously abusive, whether that would disqualify the person from claiming land, who knows? I mean, it would be so hard to prove these things. I mean, one of the most difficult aspect of dealing with land, whether in North Korea or whether in Eastern Central Europe, is the lack of documentation or credible documentation. So land itself is hard to document, going back 70, 80, 90 years in some cases, or in the case of Western Europe, a little shorter time, let alone trying to document abuses by individuals. I think that would be nearly impossible to do. What is interesting is that the South Korean policy types, it's hard to really say policy makers because they're not really making policy yet, but the policy discussions as well as literature on the Eastern and Central European cases show that many of these governments, and South Korea's policy discourse also acknowledges that in a land claims case, legal documentation, if it's found credible, can be recognized in the adjudication process, as well as oral testimony. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if oral testimony about, 3 generations ago, this landlord was horrible is really going to stand muster.
Mm-hmm. Next question is from Edward J. Baker. I don't know if it is the same Edward
Yes.
in Boston. Hi, Edward.
Hello, Ed.
As you think about those who may claim land, how would you suggest dealing with Japanese who can prove that they bought land in Korea?
As usual, Ed, thank you. And, excellent insight there. Yes, in a paper version I had worked on, I had a whole section about potential Japanese claims. And I didn't raise that today because it's already so complicated. But this is where the foreign claims become part of the discussion. So not only contemporary claims, possibly by Chinese or Russians or others in doing business in North Korea or investing in North Korea or mining work especially, but also past claims. And I've also thought about potential US claims of especially churches that had been active in North Korea and whose lands probably were confiscated. And if I looked at a document just a few days ago on Hungary, and it was staggering. First of all, it was such an excellent document. The government has done such a good job post the fall of the Soviet Union, post Cold War, of keeping track of these compensation claims and of varying types. One type of a compensation claim is what they call international bilateral claims. So, and they listed, Ed, if you're interested, I'll send it to you. The document listed numerous countries that had already made formal their claims to land on behalf of citizens of their residing in whether it's parts of Europe or the United States or what have you. And these got negotiated government to government rather than people, bringing their case up to the Hungarian government individually. So I think we're going to see a multiplication of different types of claims, historical claims by individuals as well as governments, and governments that have relatively contemporary grievances, let's say post-World War II, versus those pre-World War II, like Japan. So again, I don't have an answer because this is just, there's no research on this. But anybody who wants to do research, this is critical territory, especially for historians.
The next question is by Benjamin Ostro. I am curious about how this issue can be compared to the land disputes between Israel and Palestine residents of the Gaza Strip. Are there any lessons we have learned from that land dispute that we can apply to the issue of Korean land restitution in the North? That leads me to another question, which is to what extent would the ROK, and I suppose what becomes of the KPA meaning Korean
People's Army?
People's Army, be using its military to enforce land restitution?
Okay, I think I will take that question into consideration. I think I will, with due respect, forgo answering it because I can't go into Israel and Palestine. I'm already beyond my expertise level or comfort level in dealing with Eastern Central Europe, Cyprus, and South Africa. I also looked at Cuba because the U.S. has a list of claimants registered with the State Department for decades and decades, ready to jump on their former land in Cuba. So I mean, I have not looked at the case of Israel and Palestine, but I really encourage people to do so because I think the beauty of this exercise that I'm engaging in is something that I believe strongly in more and more, that until recently, those of us who studied Korea tended to study the peninsula in a myopic way, at most the region, and it's really the Northeast Asia region. But increasingly, we need to do comparative studies and analysis on numerous issues, not just this land issue, because we can learn so much from other cases. And I think when it comes to these kinds of thorny historical issues that require contemporary decision making, I think we have no choice but to broaden our palette and to bring in, of all places, South Africa and Cyprus into a discussion about the Koreas. Mm-hmm. So I would say similarly, if we can learn something from the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, great.
Right, there are so many more questions actually. I'm wondering what might be the best way to do this. Perhaps, let's see, maybe I would read just two more questions, and I am so sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions. Let's see, two questions, and this is from Cheryl Davis. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. First is a question of who would be eligible among the foreigners. I don't recall hearing you mention Western missionaries. I don't know if they own the land occupied in the north, either for their institutions or private homes, but they were obviously prominently there long term in addition to businesses. The second question is time frame and models from other countries. You mentioned South Africa among these. As of a trip, as they're in 2019, they're still dealing with the issue 25 years after the end of apartheid. Same issue with people's documentation being a problem, and with some of the land now being in desirable and expensive urban area now too. I think you did address some of these issues.
Yeah, I addressed the first issue, first question about whether missionaries or religious groups might be able to make claims. I'm sure some might try, but I can say that I have looked at the case of Hungary, where even though the Hungarian government adopted a compensation system, solely a compensation system for private individuals trying to reclaim land expropriated by the communist regime, they did make an exception for restitution of land, the return of land for religious communities, and they call it communal land. And it was the Jewish population in particular that had these communal lands expropriated quite violently, and that was very active. The diaspora today, very active in trying to reclaim that land. But that was acknowledged by the Hungarian government. Whether that would be a model or not, I don't know.
Okay, one more question from Leslie Wilson. Thank you for a thought-provoking webinar. My question would be how far the timeline will go back in compensation. Unlike other countries, Korea's case has double layer of Japanese occupation and communist regime to consider. My understanding is that the landowners in North Korea already had their lands taken over by the imperial Japanese government. Then the rest was taken over by the Communist Party closer to the war. How far in timeline will the government consider the land ownership?
Yes, I addressed this question too. It's really a question because I don't have the answers, obviously. And I had mentioned in my talk that the timeline will be critical. And this is something that we need to study in other case studies so that we can, again, get some best practices. The Korean case is not unique. It is not any more complicated than the cases involving Eastern Central Europe, because the Eastern Central European countries. So let me just take Germany for example. A big question was the timeline. Will the unified German government honor claims for land expropriated by the Soviets? I had mentioned this. The Soviets who had occupied Eastern Germany from 1945 to 1949, before the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, had been established. The unified government decided no, and there were lawsuits challenging this. The unified German government also considered, should the timeline reach back as far as the Nazi period, where a lot of land, especially of Jews and other minorities, had been violently expropriated. And again, the answer was they were trying to stick to what was manageable, right, during the communist regime. And so they came up with very, very complex legal justification for why they were setting the timeline parameters in a limited way. And all of the Central Eastern European countries went through a similar questioning, dealing with Soviet-dominated era or the Soviet expropriation, as well as, in many of these cases, Nazi and collaborationists expropriation of particularly Jewish land. So I think that I wouldn't look at the Korea case as unique or any more complicated, but direct us to go do the historical research on how others dealt with these issues. And the questioner right before the last question mentioned that in South Africa, the land adjudication cases are continuing, even though the post-apartheid regime became established in 1994, 1995 officially. And I would say that is nothing new. Even in unified Germany, you still have land claims issues coming up in court, some still pending. In many of these Eastern Central European countries, similar situations. In all of the Eastern Central European countries, the large majority of claims have been settled. And they were settled in the German case. I think about 92% of the claims have been settled within about a 5-6 year period. But still, there have been challenges, and then there are challenges to the challenges. And you know, in a legal system that permits lawsuits, it can be an endless process. But it doesn't mean that people will win. And much of the settlement of this land issue was closed in a relatively short time period.
I'm afraid I missed the very first question, so I'm going to have to actually read this by Christine Dennehy, who is historian of Japan. Is there any discussion in the discourse you referenced related to ethnic Koreans in Japan, especially those originally from Jeju and their descendants, who have affiliated with North Korea after 1945 through Korean schools in Japan, etc.?
I would say no, nothing that I have come across. And again, I have not been able to do an expansive research, because there are so many ways to look at this issue, which means so many different types of materials to seek out. But the discourse in South Korea is primarily focused on the costs of unification, how difficult and how expensive it will be, how to avoid chaos, and everything goes under that rubric of avoiding chaos and high cost. And so, and it's very Korean focused. And that's why I brought up who is eligible, including those who are permanent residents or whatever is the equivalent in North Korea, who may not be officially recognized North Korean citizens. I don't know the citizenship structure in North Korea, but and I was particularly thinking about Japanese who have and their descendants who had settled in the North, as well as the Chinese I had mentioned in my talk. And then of course the Koreans in Japan, I would assume some of them might be able to make claims, except it all depends on the eligibility requirement. If foreigners, and again, if these are ethnic Koreans who are not Japanese citizens, but who might be DPRK citizens officially, but must one reside in the DPRK in order to make a claim and to commit to living in the DPRK? And that would not make the ethnic Koreans in Japan a unique case, because, at least I'm thinking right now, I had posed a question in my talk. What about ethnic Koreans with ROK citizenship who want to claim ancestral lands and can document it, let's say, but they themselves are living outside of South Korea or the Korean Peninsula? They have no intention to return. Should they be disqualified? I mean, these are all, speculative questions. But very much the Japanese, the ethnic Koreans in Japan, as well as ethnic Koreans in other countries, I think they need to be included in at least the deliberative portion, if not actually in the policy deliberations.
Well, actually, I said that I would end here in terms of fielding questions, but there's just one more question. So how about a long-term lease method as a form of compensation by Jim Lee?
I had not thought of that. And again, I think long-term lease, for whom? If it's long-term lease or land use and benefits for current North Korean residents, that would warrant a different answer from an abstract, consideration of I have property rights stemming from 80 years ago, 70 years ago, and therefore I should be able to claim, even though I don't have any intention to live there or work there in North Korea. I think these have to be handled very, very judiciously in the context in which the cases emerge. I know that I have read some discussion in South Korea by South Korean policy types that there are considerations to grant lands free of charge to North Koreans. That one of when we talk about land, we have to keep in mind the number one consideration, in my view at least, should be what is in the benefit of current day North Koreans. How can a unification process accommodate and recognize their daily needs, right? Their residences and the need for residential security, the need to maintain their farms, their little plots or collective farms or communal, I'll call them communal for now. Securing their livelihood and their psychological security. I started out with that in my talk. It has to be the priority. And by doing that, we get other benefits such as communal societal stability. If North Koreans feel insecure about where they're living and how they're working and where they're working, and that they can't count on anything and bank on anything, they will tend to migrate. And this is a scenario that the South Korean government and people, would find horrifying if you had millions of people trying to migrate not only in the north, but into the south, right? So securing land, property, and livelihood for North Koreans has to be the priority when we're dealing with land issues. And that's where, current day justice, current day needs versus historical rehabilitation of people's rights, recognition of wrongs of 70 years ago. We have to weigh these things differently, in my view. But I'm sure that there will be those who disagree with me and my interpretations.
All right, well, thank you. Those of you who've posted additional questions and comments, I'll make sure that Professor Moon goes through them. And again, I would like to thank you, Professor Moon, for such a really thought-provoking presentation, and I would be very much looking forward to reading your book sometime soon.
I don't know if it's going to be a book. I haven't decided what, but I do know it's something that requires a lot of people to work on.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Our next scheduled talk will be on November 11th with Professor Heonik Kwon at Cambridge University, who is a renowned scholar known for his research on war and memory. And we invite you to subscribe to our center's email list to learn more about future events as they are announced. There is also a link. I'm sorry? There is also a link where you can contribute to the John Duncan Korean Studies Fellowship, as you see on the screen. We also like to thank friends and supporters of the Center for Korean Studies, and of course our 총영사님 and and the 유동환 영사님, and all participants for great discussion. Good afternoon, and please stay healthy and well. Thank you again.